requirements for a proper and a valid consent?
See, actually, there is a vast difference between the ingredient of a consent form as well as the requirement of a consent form. The requirement forms, it makes the consent form valid before a court of law. So, you should be very careful in obtaining consent physically in a paper where you have to obtain the name of the patient correctly. Number two, date is very, very important in a consent form. In my knowledge, when we analyzed 100 consent form, more than 30% don't have any date in the consent form, which becomes invalid immediately. In other words, if the consent form does not have a date, no advocate will present the consent form before a court, because date is the main ingredient to inform the court whether the consent was obtained prior to the procedure, prior to the operation or after the operation. So the doctors are expected to obtain consent before the procedure and before the operation. If the date is dated after the operation, prima facie it is invalid. So it will go to the dustbin only. The next point, very important point, is many of the consent form when I analyzed, I am not able to trace out the correct name of the doctor from the signature. So always a consent form must have a signature plus in capital letter the name of the doctor, or the doctor can have a rubber stamp of his name so that it can be impressed on the paper, so that after 2 years, after 5 years, anybody who takes that consent form can understand who was the doctor who operated the patient. Third ingredient is, very important one, is the name of the doctor who is going to operate the patient or do the procedure should be given in the consent form, so that the patient can understand who is going to operate his body, so that he will be very free. So he can choose his own doctor. Suppose after obtaining the consent in the operation room, the consent doctor is not available and another suitable qualified doctor is going to operate, it should be informed to the patient and another consent should be obtained for change of doctor. It's called treating doctors. So that should be followed. After the 1872 Contract Act applicable to the services given to the hospital, for example after 1995, it becomes a contract. Every agreement must have 2 witnesses. So consent form must have 2 witnesses. The witnesses need not know the ingredients of the consent, but they must know the patient signing and the doctor signing the document. To that extent, they should be knowledgeable. Normally, when I analyze the consent form, it's only a scribbling of the name of the doctor. I cannot trace out the name of the doctor. Neither the witness also sign, but without giving any address. It becomes invalid. So every witness, he has to sign, then write capital letters name, residential address, not the office address. So both the witness must sign. Normally, before the court of law, the opposite lawyer will try to invalidate the consent form by telling that originally the consent form was filled by the hospital staff. The patient used a different ink in signing his name. The doctor used another ink by signing his name. And the witnesses, after a long time, might have signed because they used yet different pen and ink. It makes the whole consent form invalidate. And they argue the case that consent was not obtained at that time. Now somebody have filled up that. So normally it is better to use only one single pen technically, so that nobody can raise any questions. There are some settings where the patient cannot sign the consent form because the patient will be unconscious. And that time relatives, parents may sign it. If they sign, next line they have to say what is the relationship to the patient. If son-in-law signs, and under that he has to say son-in-law of the patient, or father-in-law, or father, or mother, brother, all should be specified, and everything should be neatly written. If possible, the consent form should be taken in online so that it can be saved digitally. Nowadays, many modern hospitals, they save this consent form digitally so that patient cannot take away and then file a complaint against the hospital. So it can be digitalized, it can be saved easily so that it can be kept at minimum period of time, which will be very useful for the hospital. I would be very thankful to the viewers for patiently listening my lecture. I trust that my explanation to various questions will be very useful. If you want further queries, you can visit my website www.lawbrain.in. You can also get my books available from the website. You can contact me through email also. It's also available in my website for any query. I am eagerly waiting for your feedback so that I can improve upon all my presentation in future. Thank you very much.
What is the advice for the registration of a patient in a hospital?